The billionaire everyone believed was dead sat silently at the back of his own funeral. Before the final prayer was said, he uncovered a betrayal so devastating. He wished he had never come. Why is he at his own funeral? What betrayal did he hear? Who betrayed him? Why did he wish he had never come? On a cool October morning, the bells of St. Andrew's Cathedral echoed through the streets of Manhattan. The sound was slow, heavy, and deliberate, the kind reserved for someone whose name had shaped generations. Outside, the sidewalks were lined with black SUVs, luxury sedans, and television vans. Police officers guided traffic while reporters stood behind metal barricades, rehearsing their opening lines. Every major news network in America had sent a crew. The man they had come to honor was not just another billionaire. He was Edward Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Global Holdings, a man whose investments stretched across banking, technology, real estate, healthcare, and energy. For nearly 5 decades, his name had appeared on magazine covers, business rankings, and lists of the world's most influential people. To millions, he represented success. To politicians, he was a donor. To competitors, he was a force to be feared. To his family, he was supposed to be irreplaceable. 1 week earlier, the country had awakened to breaking news. Edward Whitmore's private helicopter had disappeared during a flight along the Atlantic coast. Hours later, search teams found twisted pieces of metal floating in the water. His personalized watch, fragments of the aircraft, his passport. There were no survivors. The official investigation declared the crash an accident caused by mechanical failure. The nation mourned. Financial markets reacted instantly. Whitmore Global stock fell nearly 12% before recovering as investors anticipated a leadership transition. Inside the cathedral, more than 1,000 mourners filled the polished wooden pews. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors. White lilies surrounded a mahogany casket positioned beneath a towering stained glass window. Behind it stood a large portrait of Edward, confident, composed, smiling, exactly how the world wanted to remember him. One by one, guests entered. United States senators, corporate executives, professional athletes, television personalities, religious leaders, people who had not spoken to Edward in years suddenly found beautiful words to describe him. Every handshake looked sincere. Every tear appeared convincing. Every embrace seemed heartfelt. But appearances have a way of hiding uncomfortable truths. Near the very back of the cathedral, where the light from the stained glass barely reached, an elderly black man slowly lowered himself onto a wooden pew. He wore a faded charcoal overcoat that looked decades old. A gray flat cap shaded his face. Thick glasses rested on his nose. A neatly trimmed gray beard covered most of his jaw. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped an old wooden cane. No one greeted him. No one asked who he was. To everyone else, he looked like an aging retiree who had wandered into the wrong funeral. Exactly as planned, because the old man was not a stranger. Beneath the carefully crafted disguise sat Edward Whitmore, alive. His heart pounded harder than it had during billion-dollar negotiations. He looked toward the casket carrying his name. It was empty. Everything about this day had been orchestrated with astonishing precision. The helicopter crash, the investigation, the memorial, the obituary, even the photographs displayed throughout the cathedral. Only one person in the entire building knew the truth. James Carter, his attorney, his closest friend for 43 years. James sat quietly near the front beside the family, his expression calm, though every few moments his eyes drifted toward the back of the cathedral, toward Edward. Not long ago, James had asked a question that changed everything. What if the only way to discover the truth is to disappear? At first, Edward had laughed. Then he stopped laughing because deep inside, He already suspected something was terribly wrong. He simply wasn't prepared for how wrong he had been. As the organ began to play and the minister stepped toward the pulpit, Edward took a slow breath. He believed he had come to witness love. Before the morning was over, he would discover greed, deception, and a secret buried far deeper than any coffin waiting at the front of the church. And the first crack in the perfect Whitmore family was about to appear, before the opening prayer had even finished. The minister stood behind the polished oak pulpit, adjusting the microphone as silence settled over the cathedral. Even the organ stopped playing. The only sound left was the faint rustle of expensive black suits and designer dresses as more than 1,000 mourners rose to their feet. Edward Whitmore remained seated in the last row. Hidden beneath his gray cap and thick glasses, he lowered his head just enough to avoid attracting attention. From where he sat, he could see everything: the casket, the portrait, his family. And James Carter, sitting quietly in the front row with the calm expression of a man carrying the heaviest secret in the room. James never looked back, not once. He had promised Edward he wouldn't. One glance could destroy everything. The minister opened a leather-bound Bible before looking across the congregation. We gather today to celebrate the remarkable life of Edward Alexander Whitmore, a visionary, a leader, a husband, a father, a friend. Edward closed his eyes. The words sounded beautiful, almost believable. Then the minister continued. Few men leave behind a legacy as extraordinary as his. His generosity touched countless lives, and his family was the greatest joy of his life. Edward slowly opened his eyes again. His gaze drifted toward the front pew. Victoria Whitmore sat perfectly still beside his 3 children. She wore an elegant black dress, a wide-brimmed mourning hat, and a delicate veil that partially covered her face. From a distance, she looked like the picture of heartbreak. Every few moments she gently pressed a white handkerchief against her eyes. Television cameras captured every movement. Edward knew that gesture well. Victoria had practiced crying in front of mirrors when they were younger. She believed tears were most convincing when they arrived without smudging makeup. Today, she was performing flawlessly. Beside her sat Daniel Whitmore, Edward's eldest son. His jaw remained tight, his posture rigid. He barely looked at the casket. Instead, he kept checking his phone beneath the funeral program resting on his lap. Every few seconds, a glance, a swipe, another message. Edward frowned. His funeral had barely begun. Daniel couldn't wait 30 minutes before returning to business. Rebecca Whitmore sat beside her brother. Unlike Daniel, she cried openly. Her shoulders trembled, her breathing seemed uneven. Several guests reached over to comfort her. Edward wanted to believe her grief was genuine. He truly did. Then, between sobs, he noticed something. Rebecca wasn't looking at the casket. She wasn't looking at her father's portrait. She wasn't even looking at the minister. She kept turning toward Daniel, almost nervously, as though waiting for reassurance or permission. On the opposite end of the pew sat Michael, the youngest. Unlike his brother and sister, Michael had not spoken to a single reporter outside. He hadn't shaken hands with politicians. He hadn't smiled for cameras. His eyes never left the casket. His face looked exhausted, not theatrical, not exaggerated, just broken. Edward felt something tight inside his chest. For a brief moment, he questioned whether he had judged his youngest son too harshly over the years. The minister invited everyone to bow their heads for the opening prayer. Heads lowered throughout the cathedral. Edward bowed his too. But before the minister spoke a single word, a whisper drifted across the front pew. "So, has the board confirmed the emergency meeting?" Daniel murmured without lifting his head. Rebecca answered quietly. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. And the voting?" "They moved it up." Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly. "Good." Edward's fingers tightened around the handle of his cane. The prayer hadn't even started. His body wasn't in the ground, and his children were already discussing the future of his company. He looked toward James. His oldest friend remained motionless, but Edward noticed the slight tightening of James's jaw. He had heard it too. The minister finally began praying. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for the life of your faithful servant." Yet Edward barely heard another word, because something inside him had shifted. Until that moment, he had believed his family would grieve first and deal with business later instead. Business had arrived before the first amen, and deep inside, he realized this funeral wasn't going to reveal how much his family loved him. It was going to reveal how long they had been waiting for him to die. As the congregation softly replied, "Amen," the first speaker rose from the front row. Daniel Whitmore straightened his jacket, picked up his prepared speech, and walked slowly toward the pulpit. Edward watched his eldest son with a father's hope, one that was about to be shattered by the very first sentence Daniel chose to speak. Daniel Whitmore reached the pulpit with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms instead of grieving families. He unfolded the speech he had prepared days earlier. For a brief moment, he stared at the congregation without saying a word. The silence felt respectful, almost moving. Edward watched from the last row. Despite everything he had overheard, a small part of him still hoped his eldest son would surprise him. Perhaps the whispered conversation about the board meeting had simply been unfortunate timing. Perhaps Daniel truly loved him. Daniel cleared his throat. "My father," he began, "was a remarkable businessman." Edward waited. Surely he would say more. "He built an empire from nothing." Few people nodded. "He taught us discipline, resilience, and the value of hard work." Audience remained silent. Edward frowned. Not once had Daniel said the words father, love, or family with any feeling. Everything sounded like a corporate biography. Then Daniel looked toward the executives seated together near the center aisle. "I know many of you are wondering what happens next." James Carter slowly lifted his head. Edward's heartbeat quickened. Daniel continued, "I want to assure our employees, investors, and partners that Whitmore Global remains strong. Our leadership team is fully prepared to move forward without interruption." Several executives exchanged approving glances. Edward felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't a farewell. It was a shareholder update. Daniel spoke for another 3 minutes. He listed business achievements, company milestones, acquisitions, international expansion, stock performance. By the time he finished, Edward realized something that broke his heart. His son had spoken more passionately about quarterly growth than about the man lying in the casket. Polite applause filled the cathedral. Daniel nodded once and stepped away from the microphone. As he returned to his seat, a senior board member leaned toward him and whispered, "Very well handled." Daniel gave the faintest smile. Edward closed his eyes. That single smile hurt more than any speech. Then the minister returned to the pulpit. "Thank you, Daniel. Our next speaker is someone who knew Edward long before the fortune, long before the headlines, and long before Whitmore Global became a household name." Edward looked up, his brow furrowed. He hadn't seen that name anywhere in the funeral program. The minister smiled gently, like to invite Mrs. Grace Bennett to come forward. A quiet murmur swept through the cathedral. Edward froze. Grace Bennett, after all these years. What was she doing here, and why had James never told him she was coming? Grace slowly stood from the very last pew on the opposite side of the cathedral, clutching an old brown envelope tightly against her chest. Edward's pulse quickened. He recognized that envelope. He had seen it before, 30 years ago, and it contained something that was never supposed to leave his office. Grace looked toward the pulpit then for the briefest moment. Her eyes met Edward's. His breath caught. Had she recognized him? Grace Bennett stood silently in front of the congregation, the old brown envelope still pressed against her chest. For several seconds, she didn't speak. The cathedral was so quiet that even the television cameras seemed to stop moving. Edward watched her carefully. 30 years had changed her hair, added lines to her face, slowed her walk, but her eyes, they were exactly the same, calm, honest, fearless. Grace stepped closer to the microphone and looked at the portrait above the casket. "People become famous," she said softly. "The world remembers the headlines." She paused, but forgets the human being. A few people shifted in their seats. I knew Edward Whitmore before the billion-dollar deals, before private jets, before television interviews. She smiled faintly. I knew the young man who skipped lunch so his employees could eat. Edward lowered his head. He hadn't thought about those days in decades. Grace continued. He wasn't perfect. Audience looked up. He could be stubborn, impatient, and impossible to argue with. A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the cathedral, but he never forgot where he came from. Daniel crossed his arms. His expression hardened. This wasn't the polished tribute he expected. Grace slowly lifted the old brown envelope. Carried this for 30 years. Every eye in the cathedral fixed on it. Edward's heartbeat pounded. James Carter finally looked up for the first time that morning. His calm expression disappeared. Grace took a slow breath. Edward gave me this on the day my life changed. She looked toward the family. I never imagined I would open it here. A murmur swept through the cathedral. Daniel leaned toward Rebecca. What envelope? Rebecca quietly shook her head. She had no idea, neither did anyone else. Grace placed the envelope gently on the lectern. Then she reached for the seal. Edward's fingers tightened around his cane. If she opened that envelope, everything he had believed for the last 30 years would change forever. Grace carefully broke the seal. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the silent cathedral. Edward's pulse raced. He had spent 30 years convincing himself that envelope had disappeared forever. Grace unfolded the yellowed pages for a moment. She simply stared at the handwriting. Then she looked toward Edward's portrait. Her voice trembled. This letter was written by Edward Whitmore, on the day I was dismissed from Whitmore Industries. A ripple of surprise swept through the congregation. Daniel frowned. What is she talking about? Grace continued. I never opened it. Gasps filled the room. I was too angry. She smiled sadly. I believed it contained nothing more than another apology from a billionaire who had forgotten the people who helped build his company. Edward closed his eyes. He remembered that day perfectly. He hadn't fired Grace because she had failed him. He had fired her because someone had lied, and he had believed them. Grace took a slow breath. When I got home that evening, I couldn't bring myself to read it, so I placed it in a drawer. I told myself I would open it someday. She looked down at the worn envelope. Days became months. Months became years. Before I realized it, 30 years had passed. Cathedral fell completely silent. James Carter slowly removed his glasses. Even he had never known Grace had kept the letter sealed. Grace unfolded the first page. I think Edward deserves to have his own words heard. Generate an image and be consistent with image and characters. She began to read. Dear Grace, if you're reading this, then I have already failed you. Edward's heart stopped. Those were the exact words he had written with his own hand. Grace looked up briefly. Tears filled her eyes. Then she continued reading. And with every sentence, the truth that had been buried for 3 decades began to surface. Generate an image and be consistent with image and characters. Grace steadied herself before continuing. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried through the cathedral. Dear Grace, if you're reading this, then I have already failed you. Today I made the worst decision of my life. A murmur swept through the congregation. Daniel shifted uneasily. Grace continued reading. I allowed another person's accusation to outweigh 30 years of your loyalty. Edward shut his eyes. He remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. 3 decades earlier, millions of dollars had disappeared from one of Whitmore Industries' overseas accounts. An internal investigation pointed to Grace. Every report, every witness, every document, all of it seemed to lead back to her. Edward never questioned the evidence. He signed the dismissal papers himself. Grace's voice trembled. You deserved a full investigation. Instead, I chose the quickest answer. I chose the easiest person to blame. Several executives lowered their eyes. The cathedral had become painfully still. Grace looked away from the letter for a moment. I lost everything that day. My job, my reputation, my home, my friends. She swallowed hard. My husband believed the headlines. Left me 6 months later. A collective gasp echoed through the church. Edward felt as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. He had never known. Not one person had ever told him what happened to Grace after she walked out of his office. Grace looked back at the letter. If I ever discover the truth, I promise I will spend the rest of my life making this right. Edward's eyes filled with tears. He had written those words, but he had never kept that promise, because he never found the truth. Or so he believed. Grace folded the first page, then slowly reached into the envelope again. There was something else inside. The congregation leaned forward. Grace removed a second sheet. Unlike the first, this one wasn't written by Edward. It was a forensic audit report. James Carter's face lost all color. He recognized it instantly. So did Edward. It was dated 3 weeks after Grace had been fired, and stamped across the top in bold red letters were words Edward had never seen before. New evidence. Grace held the forensic report with trembling hands. Never read this aloud, she said quietly, but Edward deserved to know the truth. Congregation remained motionless. Even the television cameras seemed reluctant to move. Grace adjusted her glasses and began reading. Independent forensic audit concludes that Grace Bennett did not authorize, approve, or receive any of the missing funds. A wave of disbelief swept through the cathedral. Daniel's confident expression disappeared. Rebecca slowly covered her mouth. Michael closed his eyes. Grace continued. The evidence used to justify Ms. Bennett's dismissal was based on altered financial records and falsified approval documents. Edward's grip tightened on his cane. His breathing became uneven. Someone had manufactured the evidence. Someone inside Whitmore Industries had framed Grace. Grace turned to the final page. This report identified the individual responsible. Silence became unbearable. James Carter stood abruptly. Grace. His voice cracked. You don't have to do this. Grace looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes. Waited 30 years. Not waiting another minute. She lowered her gaze to the report. Investigation concluded that the false records were created by. She stopped. Her hands began to shake. The entire cathedral leaned forward. Even the minister forgot to breathe. Grace slowly lifted her eyes from the page. Then she looked directly toward the Whitmore family. The person responsible wasn't a forgotten accountant, wasn't a rival executive, wasn't an outsider. It was someone who had been sitting in this cathedral since the service began, someone who had just spent the morning pretending to mourn Edward Whitmore. And as Grace prepared to speak the name aloud, that person quietly rose from their seat. The person who had risen from their seat did not run. They did not shout. They simply stood slowly, deliberately. Every eye in the cathedral turned toward them. It was Richard Holloway, the former chief financial officer of Whitmore Industries. Now 72 years old, Richard had retired more than 20 years earlier. To most people in the room, he was nothing more than a respected former executive paying his final respects. Edward's breathing became shallow. Richard, his oldest business partner. The man he had trusted with every major financial decision for nearly 15 years. Grace looked directly at him. You don't have to stand, Richard. You've been expecting this day for a very long time. Richard's face turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Voice sounded calm, but his hands betrayed him. They were shaking. Grace lifted the report. Investigation concluded that the financial records used to dismiss me were altered from your office. A murmur swept across the cathedral. Richard forced a laugh. That report is 30 years old. Proves nothing. James Carter stepped forward. It proves more than you realize. The first time since the funeral began, James walked to Grace's side. Commissioned that investigation. Gasps echoed through the church. I received the final report 3 weeks after Grace was fired. Richard's confidence disappeared. James continued. I intended to give it to Edward. Before I could, the report vanished. Grace held up the faded brown envelope. It didn't vanish. It was placed inside Edward's apology letter. James looked at her in disbelief. You had it all these years, Grace nodded. Never knew it was there. Never opened the envelope until today. Edward felt his knees weaken. The evidence that could have cleared Grace's name had been sitting inside a sealed envelope for 30 years. Richard slowly took a step backward. You can't prove I changed those records. James looked him straight in the eye. No, someone else can. Cathedral fell silent once again. James turned toward the entrance. Person who completed that investigation is here today. Every head turned. The massive wooden doors at the back of the cathedral slowly opened. An elderly black woman entered, carrying a weathered leather briefcase. Her steps were slow, but confident. James smiled faintly. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Margaret Ellis, the forensic accountant who uncovered the truth, and she's brought the original files." Margaret Ellis walked slowly down the center aisle. The worn leather briefcase never left her hand. Every step echoed through the cathedral. She stopped beside Grace and placed the briefcase gently on the lectern. Then she looked at Richard Holloway. "It's been a long time." Richard said nothing. For the first time in decades, the confident executive looked frightened. Margaret unclipped the brass locks on the briefcase. Inside were dozens of aging files, bank statements, audit reports, handwritten notes. Original ledger pages, each one carefully preserved. She removed a thick binder labeled Whitmore Industries Internal Investigation. Original evidence. Margaret held it up for everyone to see. "This is the only complete copy. Kept it because I believed one day someone would finally ask the right questions." Richard's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I made sure those files were destroyed." The words escaped his mouth before he realized what he had admitted. The cathedral erupted, gasps, whispers. Reporters immediately raised their cameras. Daniel stared at Richard in disbelief. "What did you just say?" Richard froze. He had trapped himself. Margaret calmly opened the binder. She removed a photograph and handed it to James Carter. James turned it toward the congregation. It showed Richard alone in the accounting archive late at night. The timestamp matched the week Grace was dismissed. "This photograph was taken by the building's overnight security camera," Margaret explained. "It was never included in the official company records." She pulled out another document. "This is the original transaction log. The version presented to Edward had 3 pages removed." James nodded slowly. "And those missing pages?" Margaret looked directly at Richard. "They showed the money was transferred using your executive authorization code." Room fell silent. Edward closed his eyes. For 30 years. He had blamed the wrong person. He had destroyed the life of the woman who had been loyal to him from the beginning, while the man truly responsible had stood beside him, accepting promotions, bonuses, and his trust. Richard took one slow step backward, then another. His eyes darted toward the cathedral doors. Edward recognized that look immediately. It wasn't the face of an innocent man. It was the face of someone realizing there was no way out anymore. Richard took another step toward the cathedral doors, then another. "I think I've heard enough," he said, forcing a smile. "No," James Carter replied firmly. "You've heard exactly what you've been avoiding for 30 years. Before Richard could move again, 2 security officers quietly stepped into the aisle. The reporters sensed history unfolding. Camera shutters echoed through the cathedral. Richard looked around the room. The confidence that had carried him through decades of deception had vanished. "I made one mistake," he muttered. Margaret Ellis shook her head. "No, you made thousands. You stole money, forged records. You destroyed an innocent woman's life. You convinced a good man to doubt the most loyal employee he ever had." Richard's shoulders slumped for the first time. He stopped denying it. "Never thought anyone would find out." The words landed like thunder. The cathedral fell silent. Grace closed her eyes. 30 years. And finally, the truth had been spoken aloud. Richard lowered his head. "It started with one transfer. I told myself I'd replace the money. The company grew, so did the amounts. When the audit got close, I needed someone else to take the blame." His voice broke. Grace was the easiest target. Edward felt tears running down his face. He wanted to stand, he wanted to shout, he wanted to tell Grace how deeply sorry he was, but he couldn't, not yet. James quietly nodded to the security officers. Richard surrendered without another word. As he was escorted toward the doors, he paused beneath Edward's portrait. He looked up. "I'm sorry, Edward." Then he disappeared into the bright afternoon sunlight. The cathedral remained silent. Grace folded Edward's letter carefully and placed it back inside the old brown envelope. "I spent 30 years believing my life ended the day I left his office," she said softly. "But today I learned something." She looked at Edward's portrait. "Truth may arrive late, but when it finally comes, it sets more than one person free." Those words pierced Edward's heart. He slowly stood from the last pew. His cane rested against the bench. His hands reached for the gray cap, then the thick glasses. One by one, he removed the disguise. A few people near the back gasped. One woman screamed. Heads turned across the cathedral like a wave. James closed his eyes. The secret was over. Edward Whitmore stepped into the center aisle, alive. The congregation stared in stunned silence. Grace's eyes filled with tears for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. Edward finally stopped in front of her. His voice trembled. "I came here to learn who loved my fortune." He looked around the cathedral. "But I discovered something far more important." He turned back to Grace. "I learned the cost of believing the wrong people." With tears streaming down his face, he bowed his head before the woman he had wronged. "I'm sorry." Grace looked at him for a long time, then, without saying a word, she stepped forward and embraced him. The cathedral erupted, not in applause, but in quiet tears. Outside, reporters rushed to break the biggest story in American history. Inside, none of that mattered anymore. Edward hadn't attended his own funeral to see how the world would remember him. He had attended it to discover the truth. And in the end, the greatest wealth he recovered wasn't his company. It was the courage to admit he had been wrong, ask for forgiveness, and begin making things right while he was still alive. Edward Whitmore never discovered who truly loved him by reading a will. He discovered it by attending his own funeral. And in the end, the greatest fortune he recovered wasn't his company. It was the truth, the courage to admit he had been wrong, and the chance to make things right while he was still alive. Because money can rebuild businesses, but only humility can rebuild broken lives.